Ethan lived alone at the edge of the wild forest, far from the nearest town. His small wooden cabin stood on the rocky slope of a hill, facing a wide-open valley where alien trees swayed under two suns. Most days were quiet, filled only with the sound of wind through the leaves and the occasional cry of strange animals that hunted at night. Ethan was used to the silence. He had been alone for years. Once, long ago, he had a family, but they were gone now, taken by a sickness that even the doctors of this new colony could not stop. Since then, he had kept to himself, avoiding people, avoiding their questions, and avoiding the pain of remembering. He spent his days chopping wood, fixing the roof when the rain ate away at the old boards, and hunting small creatures for food. Sometimes he would sit outside at night, staring at the alien stars, wondering why he was still here when everything he cared about was gone. Life had become simple, almost empty, and he told himself that was enough. But one night, everything changed. The wind was wild, carrying the smell of rain and the sound of a coming storm. Ethan was stacking firewood when he heard it, a noise that did not belong. It wasn't the howl of the forest beasts or the creak of the trees. It was soft, weak, almost like a whimper. He froze, listening. The sound came again, carried by the wind, a voice, faint and broken, somewhere in the darkness beyond his cabin. Ethan took his flashlight and his old hunting rifle, his boots sinking into the wet earth as he stepped out into the storm. The rain began to fall in heavy drops, soaking through his coat. He followed the sound, moving down the hill into the thick grass. That's when he saw it, a faint glow, lying low against the ground. It was like spilled light, shimmering in the rain. When he came closer, he saw it wasn't light at all. It was blood, glowing faint blue, dripping in a trail that led into the trees. His heart beat faster. Every instinct told him to turn back. But something in that weak sound pushed him forward. He followed the glowing trail, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches until he reached a small clearing. And there, lying in the mud, was the strangest and most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was a girl, or something close to human, her skin pale with a faint silver shine, her hair long and tangled, sticking to her face from the rain. Her clothes were torn and stained with the same glowing blood that marked the trail. She was breathing, but only barely. Her lips moved, whispering words he could not understand. Her voice was soft, trembling, filled with fear. Then her eyes met his large, bright, and unlike any humans, and for a moment, a storm faded away. He saw pain in them, but also something else, a desperate plea before he could say anything. Her eyes closed, and her head fell to the side. Ethan dropped to his knees, placing the rifle aside. He touched her face gently, feeling how cold she was despite the heat of the fever running through her body. He had no idea who she was or what had happened to her. But he knew one thing. If he left her here, she would die. With effort, he slid his arms under her and lifted her. She was light, far too light, as if she hadn't eaten in days. He carried her back through the rain, up the hill toward his cabin. The storm grew heavier, lightning flashing over the valley. He stumbled once, nearly falling, but he held on. By the time he reached the cabin, his clothes were soaked, his arms numb from the weight. Inside, he laid her on his bed and pulled a blanket over her. The glow from her wounds lit the room in a strange, eerie light. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't know how to treat an alien, but he had some medical supplies, bandages, water, an old first aid kit from his colony days. He began cleaning her wounds, wincing when she stirred and let out a soft cry. Her skin felt warm, too warm, and the glow from the cuts seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. As he worked, a question burned in his mind. Who was she, and why was she here? Outside, the storm raged. But it wasn't the only danger. Ethan didn't see them yet, but far away, in the forest, lights moved between the trees. Someone else was looking for the girl. And if they found her here, his quiet, lonely life would be gone forever. Ethan sat beside the bed. Watching her breathe, her lips moved again, forming a single word in a broken voice. It wasn't in his language, but the way she said it made his chest tighten. It was a plea, a cry for help. And in that moment, Ethan made a choice. No matter who she was, no matter what trouble she brought, he was going to save her. Ethan barely slept that night. The sound of rain beating against the roof, mixing with the shallow, uneven breaths of the alien girl on his bed. Every few minutes he checked her forehead, feeling the unnatural heat. And each time he did, his worry grew. Her wounds were wrapped, but the strange glowing blood still seeped slowly through the bandages, giving the room a faint blue light. He had never seen anything like it, and no medical manual from the colony would tell him how to treat it. Still, he refused to let her fade away in front of him. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ground wet and the air heavy with mist. Ethan heated water on the small stove, preparing a broth from what little food he had left. When he brought it to her, her eyes opened slightly, unfocused, her lips moving in a whisper. He tried to give her the cup, but she didn't understand, so he held the rim to her lips and helped her drink, feeling her tremble under his hand when she pulled away. She looked at him for a long moment, as if studying him, and then said a single word he didn't know. He pointed to himself and said, "Ethan," slowly, clearly. She blinked, then repeated it, her voice weak but steady. It was a start. He spent the morning tending to her and cleaning his tools. But a sound outside caught his attention, a deep hum that didn't belong in the forest. He went to the window and froze through the mist. A dark shape moved between the trees, tall and armored, carrying a long weapon that glinted in the morning light. There was more than 3 figures, scanning the ground, bending to examine the mud. They were tracking something, and Ethan knew exactly what. He shut the shutters quietly and moved to the trapdoor under the rug. It was a small storage space for supplies, barely big enough for a person to fit. He whispered for her to stay silent and guided her down into the darkness, covering her with blankets and boxes to hide her completely. Her wide, luminous eyes stared up at him for a moment, fear clear in them. He nodded once, trying to reassure her, then closed the trapdoor. A sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Ethan opened it to find one of the soldiers standing there, armor dripping with dew. The alien's voice was rough, its words in broken human speech. "Looking for dangerous fugitive," it said, scanning the interior of the cabin. "Not safe. You stay inside." Ethan kept his expression calm and nodded, answering with a slow, "Haven't seen anyone." The soldier's black eyes lingered on him, searching for any sign of a lie. Finally, it stepped back, giving a strange salute before walking away. Ethan watched through the narrow gap in the shutter as they moved deeper into the forest, their weapons ready. When he lifted the trapdoor, she was curled up, breathing fast. He helped her out and offered water, but she shook her head, still shaken, for a long time. Neither spoke. Ethan knew now that whoever was after her would not give up easily. The glow from her wounds wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. If those soldiers saw it, it would lead them right to her. As the day went on, she began to speak more, using short words and gestures to explain. Ethan learned her name, Sira. Her voice softened when she said it, and he repeated it until she smiled faintly from what he could gather. She had escaped from somewhere, someone who had hurt her, someone powerful. She touched her arm and made a cutting motion, then shook her head, a signal, perhaps, that something inside her could not be removed. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. She was running from hunters, and now they were close. That night, as the last light faded, Ethan was sitting by the fire when he noticed the glow from her skin was brighter. It was not just from the wound's faint lines, almost like markings, ran up her arms and neck, pulsing softly. She caught him looking and quickly covered herself with the blanket. In a broken mix of her language and his, she tried to explain the markings were a signal. A way for her enemies to find her no matter where she went. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that hiding her in his cabin wouldn't work forever. If they were going to keep her safe, they would have to move. The forest outside was quiet now, but he knew that didn't mean it was safe. The searchers might return at any moment, and if they brought more, he wouldn't be able to protect her here. He began gathering supplies, food, water, a small knife. The old rifle. Sierra watched him, her eyes full of questions. When he gestured toward the door and pointed to the forest, she shook her head in fear. He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder, speaking slowly. "If we stay, they will find you." She looked at the floor, then at him, and finally nodded. By the time the moons were high, they were ready. Ethan strapped his pack on and helped her to her feet. She was still weak, leaning against him as they stepped into the cold night air. Behind them, the cabin was silent, but Ethan knew he might never see it again. Ahead lay the dark forest, full of unknown dangers, but also their only chance. They moved into the shadows, the faint blue glow of her skin hidden beneath layers of cloth, far behind in the distance. A low hum began to rise again, growing louder. With every step they took, the forest was darker than Ethan remembered. The thick canopy blocking the light from the moons, and the wet ground swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Each breath came out as a faint mist in the cold night air, and every shadow seemed alive. Sierra leaned heavily on him, her pace slow, but she refused to stop. From time to time, she glanced over her shoulder, her glowing eyes scanning the darkness. As if expecting someone to emerge at any moment, they followed a narrow game trail through the trees, twisting between massive roots and low branches. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves hung in the air. Ethan kept his rifle in one hand, his other arm wrapped around Sierra's waist to steady her. He didn't know how far they could go before dawn, but he knew they needed distance. Every step away from the cabin felt like a step toward danger, but also toward survival. Hours passed in silence until the first light of morning began to filter through the trees. The faint glow on Sierra's skin had dimmed under the cloth wraps Ethan had tied around her arms and neck. They came to a shallow stream and stopped to drink. Sierra knelt by the water, her reflection broken by ripples, her expression unreadable. Ethan crouched beside her, keeping his eyes on the forest beyond. That was when he heard it, a faint mechanical whine. Almost too soft to notice, he froze, tilting his head to listen. The sound was getting closer, weaving through the trees like a predator stalking prey. Sierra noticed his tension and stiffened. She whispered something urgent in her language. Pointing toward the far bank, Ethan understood enough. They had to move. Now they crossed the stream quickly, their boots splashing through the icy water. The sound behind them grew louder, followed by a faint blue flicker between the trees. Search drones, small but fast, designed to track heat and movement. Ethan grabbed Sierra's hand and pulled her into the thick undergrowth, pushing through thorned bushes and tangled vines, ignoring the sting on his skin. The forest floor rose steeply ahead, leading to a rocky ridge by the time they reached it. Both of them were breathing hard. Ethan pulled Sierra down behind a boulder. Just as the first drone floated into view, its smooth metal body glinting in the sunlight, it hovered slowly, scanning the area with a red beam. The soft hum of its engine filling the air. Ethan held his breath, his finger on the rifle's trigger. Sierra stayed perfectly still, her eyes locked on the machine. The beam passed dangerously close to them, stopping for a moment on the wet footprints they had left in the mud. Then, without warning, the drone shot upward, vanishing into the trees. With a sharp burst of speed, they waited several minutes before moving again. Ethan knew the drone was going to bring others, maybe even soldiers. The only advantage they had was time. He guided Sarah along the ridge until they found a narrow gap in the rocks leading to a hidden hollow. The small space was sheltered and dry. With a roof of twisted roots and stone, it was barely enough to sit in, but it gave them cover from the sky. Ethan set down his pack and offered Sarah a piece of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it, eating slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. When she finished, she reached into her torn clothing and pulled out something small, a thin metal disc, no larger than a coin. She placed it in his hand, murmuring a single word, "Hide." He turned the disc over, noticing tiny symbols etched into it. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly. Before he could ask, Sarah gestured to her arm, tapping the cloth covering her glowing markings. The message was clear. This disc was connected to the thing inside her. Ethan realized it might be the very device tracking her, and hiding it might give them a chance. He buried it deep under the roots and rocks in the hollow, covering it with soil. Sarah seemed relieved, though her expression remained guarded. As night fell again, they stayed hidden. Listening to the distant hum of machines and the faint metallic clang of soldiers moving through the forest, Ethan kept the rifle close, every muscle tense. At one point, Sarah shifted closer to him, not speaking, but her hand brushed his arm. A small sign of trust. He didn't know why he cared so much about her survival. Maybe because she was alone and hunted, just like he had once been in a different way. Or maybe because the moment he had carried her into his cabin, he had already decided she was his responsibility. In the early hours, the sounds outside faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the forest at rest. Ethan dared to think they might have thrown off their pursuers, at least for now. But when Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was heavy with warning. She told him, in broken human words, they never stop. Ethan didn't need a translation for the look in her eyes. She had been running for a long time, and she knew this was only the beginning. He tightened his grip on the rifle, looking out into the shadows beyond their hiding place. Whatever came next, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The morning came, cold and gray, the forest dripping with the memory of last night's mist. Ethan woke first, his back stiff from sleeping against the rough stone wall of the hollow. Sarah was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow, the faint glow from her skin hidden beneath the cloth wraps. For a brief moment, the world was quiet, almost peaceful. But Ethan knew it wouldn't last. He stepped outside, scanning the ridge for movement. From up here, he could see far across the treetops, the rising sun casting long shadows over the valley. There were no patrols in sight, no drones humming in the air, but the unease in his chest refused to fade. He had lived long enough on this planet to know that when the forest was this still, it meant something was hunting. When he returned to the hollow, Sarah was awake, sitting cross-legged, her eyes on the narrow gap in the rocks. She spoke softly, using a mix of her language and the few human words she had learned. She told him about the warlord, a ruthless leader who ruled through fear and owned people as if they were tools. She had been taken young, trained to serve, and marked with the glowing patterns that bound her to him. Those markings were more than decoration. They were alive, a living signal embedded under her skin. Impossible to remove without killing her, her escape had been a miracle. But it also meant the warlord would never stop hunting her. Ethan listened, his jaw tightening. He had seen cruelty before, but this was different. Here was someone who had never been given a chance to live free. Someone whose very body had been turned into a beacon for her enemies. He thought of his own life, empty and quiet, and wondered if maybe the universe had sent her to him for a reason. They moved again by midday, keeping to higher ground where the thick canopy gave them cover. Sarah walked a little stronger now, though she still leaned on him when the ground was steep along the way. They found the remains of an old outpost, broken walls overgrown with vines. A rusted antenna pointing uselessly at the sky. Ethan decided to stop here for a while. The solid walls offering more shelter than the open forest. He scavenged what he could, a few metal scraps, a cracked water canister. Even an old blanket that was still usable, Sarah explored quietly. Running her fingers over the moss-covered stones. For a moment, she almost looked like she belonged here. But then, her eyes grew distant, and she turned away as the sun dipped low. Ethan noticed her growing restless. She kept glancing toward the east. Her expression tightening when he asked, she pointed to her chest, then to the horizon. He understood the tracker inside her was reacting. Sensing something that night, they lit no fire. Sitting in silence as the wind whistled through the broken walls, Ethan dozed lightly, but Sarah remained awake, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. It happened in the middle of the night, a faint tremor in the ground, then a deep, rhythmic thump. Ethan was on his feet instantly. Rifle in hand, from the tree line below, pale beams of light swept across the valley, moving slowly but steadily. Toward them, Sarah grabbed his arm, whispering a single word, "Run." They slipped out the far side of the ruins, moving quickly through the shadows behind them. Shapes emerged from the forest, tall, armored figures. Their armor reflecting the pale moonlight. One of them paused, scanning the ground, and then gave a sharp signal to the others. The hunt was back on. They ran until their lungs burned, following the ridge until it ended in a steep drop. Below was a narrow river, fast and cold, the current pulling at the rocks. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took Sarah's hand and jumped. The water hit like ice, swallowing them in darkness. The roar filling his ears, he fought to keep hold of her, pushing them toward the far bank. By the time they crawled onto the shore, both were shivering, their clothes heavy with water. They didn't stop moving until they found a small cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. Inside, the air was warmer, the sound of the river muffled. Ethan lit a small light from his pack, the dim glow casting shadows on the walls. Sarah sat against the rock, her eyes closed, breathing hard when she opened them. She looked at him with something new, not just gratitude, but trust. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold, and whispered his name. He squeezed her hand back, knowing they couldn't stay here for long. The soldiers would search both sides of the river, and sooner or later they would find the trail. But for now, in the quiet of the cave, with only the sound of water beyond, Ethan allowed himself a moment to believe they could survive this. He didn't know how. He didn't know where they would go next. But he knew one thing. He would not let them take her. Whatever came, he would stand between her and the ones hunting her, even if it meant never returning to the life he had before. The cave gave them shelter for 2 days, but every hour felt like borrowed time. Ethan used the quiet to rest and to dry their clothes. Keeping the small light hidden from the outside, Sarah's strength was returning slowly, the fever breaking. Though her wounds still ached when she moved, she spoke more now, teaching him words from her language, sometimes laughing softly when he mispronounced them. Those moments almost felt normal. But the shadow of the hunt was always there, pressing at the edges of their peace on the third night. The river's calm was broken by a low, distant rumble. Ethan rose instantly, his instincts sharp. Through the curtain of vines, faint flashes of light danced in the distance. Sarah stiffened beside him, whispering a single word he now understood. Soldiers. Ethan grabbed the rifle, slinging the pack over his shoulder. They couldn't stay, not now. Not with the sound of machines rolling closer along the far bank. They slipped into the forest again, following a narrow animal trail. The ground was slick from recent rain, and twice Ethan had to catch Sarah before she slipped. They moved uphill, the trees growing denser, until they reached a ridge overlooking a valley lit by strange fires. Below, a camp sprawled, not the warlord's soldiers, but a different group. Their armor was mismatched, their banners unfamiliar. Syrah's eyes narrowed as she studied them. Then she whispered in a tense voice that these were mercenaries. Hired hunters paid to find her and deliver her alive. It meant the search had widened, and anyone could be an enemy now. Ethan wanted to circle wide around the camp, but the forest on either side was too steep and rocky. If they tried to climb in the dark, they would make too much noise. The only choice was to move closer. Using the shadows to slip past, they descended slowly. Every step careful, the glow from the campfires flickering on the wet leaves. Ethan could hear voices now, rough and sharp, speaking in a mix of languages he barely understood. Somewhere in the camp, a dog-like creature barked. The sound cutting through the night, Syrah froze, pressing herself against a tree. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her forward, but the barking grew louder. Closer, a sudden shout went. Up from the camp, figures moved quickly toward their position. Torches swinging, weapons ready. Ethan pulled Syrah into the thick brush, crouching low. The mercenaries spread out, searching the trees, their lights sweeping over the undergrowth. One beam passed just inches from Syrah's face, and Ethan held his breath. The man holding it muttered something and moved on. They waited until the last light faded before moving again. By dawn, they had put miles between themselves and the camp. But the escape came at a cost. Syrah's steps were slower, her face pale from exhaustion. They reached a narrow ravine where a small stream trickled between the rocks. Ethan decided they would rest here, at least until nightfall, as she drank. From the stream, he scouted the surrounding area. Looking for signs of pursuit, what he found instead made his stomach tighten fresh tracks. Heavy boots, too recent to ignore. Someone was ahead of them, not behind, when he returned. Syrah was sitting on a rock, her eyes closed, but she opened them quickly when she saw his expression. He told her with a gesture, "Danger ahead, danger." Behind, they had walked into a trap without even knowing it. Before they could move, a voice rang out from the trees, deep and commanding. "Drop the weapon, human." Ethan spun toward the sound. Spotting 3 armored soldiers stepping from the shadows, weapons aimed. Their armor was marked with the warlord's crest, the same one Syrah had described. She stepped back instinctively, her hand clutching Ethan's sleeve. One soldier pointed at her, speaking in their own language. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They had found their prize. In that moment, Ethan knew running was useless. He raised the rifle, the barrel steady despite the pounding in his chest. The lead soldier laughed. "A sharp, metallic sound, you will not win," he said, switching to rough human speech. Ethan's answer was a single shot, the crack of the rifle echoing through the ravine. The bullet struck the soldier's shoulder, spinning him back. The other 2 lunged forward, firing bursts of energy that lit the rocks with blue light. Ethan pushed Syrah down behind a boulder, returning fire with calm precision for long seconds. The air was filled with the clash of human steel and alien energy. When the last echo faded, 2 soldiers lay still, and the wounded one had fled into the forest. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. Syrah crawled out from behind the boulder, her eyes wide. She touched his arm and whispered something he didn't understand, but he knew it was thanks. He checked her for injuries. Relieved to find none, still, the fight had changed everything. The warlord's men now knew exactly where they were, and more would come. They left the ravine before the sun was fully up. The forest ahead seemed endless, but it was the only path left. Ethan didn't know if they could outrun the hunt forever, but as long as Syrah was with him, he would keep moving, and deep inside, he could feel something building. Not just the will to survive, but the will to fight back. The sun sank low, turning the forest into a maze of long shadows. Ethan and Sierra had been walking for hours without speaking. Their breaths shallow, their ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The fight in the ravine had left them both shaken, but neither would admit it. Ethan could still feel the vibration of the energy blasts in his bones, the memory of the burning light etched into his mind. Sierra's gaze was fixed ahead, but every few steps she glanced back. The fear in her eyes hidden behind a mask of control. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and gave way to open hills scattered with jagged rocks. From here, Ethan could see the faint glow of fires in the distance. Too steady to be wild flames, he crouched low, motioning for Sierra to follow. They crept along a ridge until they could see the source, a warlord's outpost. Small but heavily guarded, with patrols circling the perimeter and tall antenna towers humming with energy. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was no coincidence. The outpost was placed to cut off their escape. Sierra crouched beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him that one of those towers was broadcasting a tracking signal, making it easier for their hunters to find her if they destroyed it. They could at least slow the chase, maybe even vanish into the hills. Ethan studied the patrols, counting their steps, their pauses, the timing of their movements. It was dangerous, maybe impossible, but if they kept running without doing something, they would be caught sooner or later. They waited until the darkest hour, when the moons dipped low and the guards grew tired. Ethan led Sierra down the ridge, sticking to the shadows. His rifle ready, the ground was uneven, and twice they had to freeze as a patrol passed close enough for him to hear their boots on the dirt. At the base of the tower, a humming panel glowed, faint blue, pulsing with the same rhythm as the markings on Sierra's skin. Her breath quickened as she saw it, her hand tightening on his arm. Ethan knelt. Pulling a small tool from his pack, he began to pry the panel open, the sound barely audible over the steady hum. Halfway through, a shout cut through the night. A beam of light swept over them, and the alarm sounded. Ethan yanked the panel free and fired into the exposed core, sparks exploding in all directions. The hum faltered, then died, the blue glow fading to nothing. Sierra grabbed his sleeve, pulling him toward the hills as soldiers poured from the outpost, shouting in anger. Energy blasts lit the night, scorching the ground where they had been seconds before. They ran, weaving between rocks, the shouts behind them growing fainter. With every turn, by the time they stopped, the sky was turning pale with the first light of dawn. They collapsed behind a boulder, both gasping for breath. Sierra looked at him, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "You? Brave," she said in halting human words. Ethan shook his head, but there was no denying the spark of pride in his chest. For the first time since finding her, he felt like they were more than prey. They had struck back, even if only for a moment, but their victory was short-lived. From the hills beyond, a deep rumble began to rise, the sound of heavy engines. Ethan peeked over the boulder and froze on the far slope. A warlord's war machine crawled into view, a massive armored walker, its metal legs crushing rock beneath its weight. Mounted turrets scanned the terrain, searching for any sign of movement. Sierra's face paled, her hand covering the markings on her arm as if to hide them from sight. The machine stopped, its sensors turning toward their position. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her into a narrow crack between two slabs of stone. The space was barely wide enough for them both, their shoulders pressed together. The walker's shadow fell over them, blocking the light. Ethan could hear the whir of its targeting systems, the slow creak of its legs shifting. For a moment, he thought it had found them. Then, as quickly as it had stopped, it moved on, the sound of its steps fading into the distance. They stayed, hidden for several minutes before emerging, the tension still heavy in the air. Ethan knew the walker would be back, and when it did, it would not pass them by again. They continued deeper into the hills. the wind carrying the faint scent of smoke from the outpost they had left behind. Ciro walked beside him, no longer just following, but matching his pace. She no longer looked only to him for protection. She moved like someone ready to fight. When the sun reached its highest point, they found shelter in a narrow cave. Ethan sat at the entrance, watching the horizon. While Ciro rested against the wall, the silence stretched between them until she spoke again. Her voice steady. "You help me, I help you," she said, her words deliberate. Ethan turned to her. Confused, she touched her chest, then pointed toward the distance. The warlord. Enemy to you too. He understood then if they wanted to survive. They couldn't just keep running. At some point, they would have to turn and face the hunters head-on. And Ciro was telling him she was ready. The thought was dangerous, maybe even foolish. But as he looked at her, something in her eyes told him it might be their only chance. Ethan nodded once, and in that silent agreement, the plan for their final stand began to take shape. The plan came together in silence. Not with long discussions or maps, but with looks, gestures, and the shared understanding that there would be no running after this. Ethan and Ciro knew the warlord's forces would follow the walker's path through the hills, using it as a shield and a weapon. If they could trap it, slow it down, and hit the soldiers hard, they might have a chance to end the hunt for good. It was dangerous, almost hopeless. But neither of them hesitated. They spent the day preparing, moving from rock to rock. Setting up crude traps from what they had, loose boulders were wedged, so they could be pushed onto the narrow path. Dry brush was packed with Ethan's small store of fuel to make fire barriers. Ciro worked beside him, her hands steady, her movements sharp. When the sun dipped behind the hills, they were ready. They took position on a high ridge overlooking the path. The wind cold against their faces. Night fell slowly, the sky deepening into black. Ethan lay flat on the stone, rifle ready, eyes fixed on the bend where the walker would appear. Ciro crouched beside him, a short blade in her hand. Her breathing calm but controlled. The sound came first, a deep, echoing thud that grew with each step. Then the glow of searchlights swept over the rocks, and the massive shape emerged from the darkness. The walker's legs moved like metal predators, crushing everything beneath them. Behind it, soldiers followed in tight formation, their weapons scanning the hills. Ethan waited until the lead leg stepped onto the narrowest part of the path. Then he gave a sharp nod to Sarah. And together, they shoved the first boulder free. It crashed down, slamming into the walker's knee joint. Sparks flying, the massive machine staggering, shouts rang out from the soldiers, their formation breaking as they scrambled to find the source of the attack. Ethan fired, the rifle's crack echoing off the hills, dropping one soldier before. The rest dove for cover. Ciro lit the fuel-soaked brush, flames roaring up in a wall that cut the soldiers off from retreat. The walker tried to turn, its legs grinding against the rocks. Ethan aimed for the exposed joint again, each shot ringing in his ears. Ciro moved like lightning, darting down the slope toward the soldiers, her blade flashing in the firelight. The air was filled with a clash of metal, the sharp hiss of energy blasts, and the roar of the flames. Ethan kept firing, covering her as she cut through the nearest attackers. Her movements a mix of desperation and skill. One soldier broke through and charged up the ridge toward Ethan. He met the man halfway, slamming the rifle's stock into his chest. The impact knocking the wind out of him, Ethan didn't stop, driving him back until he tumbled over the edge into the fire below. The smell of smoke and burning metal filled the air, the walker groaning as it struggled to stay upright. Ciro leaped onto its damaged leg, using the height to launch herself onto the body of the machine. She drove her blade into a glowing panel, sparks showering the air. The walker let out a high-pitched mechanical wail before collapsing sideways into the flames. The soldiers who Remain tried to regroup, but the fire cut them off. Some fled into the darkness, others dropped their weapons and surrendered. Ethan climbed down to where Syrah stood, her chest heaving, her skin streaked with dirt and blood. She met his eyes. And in that moment, neither of them needed words. They had survived. Not because they were stronger than the warlord's hunters, but because they had refused to give up. When the fire finally died down, the hills were silent again. Ethan and Syrah searched the wreckage, finding no sign of the warlord himself, but they knew this victory was more than a battle. It was a message. Syrah was no longer prey, and Ethan was no longer a man living in the shadows. They walked away from the burning remains, the stars bright above them, the cold wind carrying the scent of smoke into the night. By dawn, they reached the crest of a hill that overlooked the wide valley beyond. In the distance, Ethan could see the faint glow of a settlement, the promise of safety, maybe even allies. Syrah stood beside him, her hand brushing his. "You stay," she said softly, her words careful but full of meaning. Ethan looked at her, then at the valley, and nodded. He had no home to return to, but here, beside her, he had found something worth staying for. As they descended into the valley, the first light of the new day touched the land. It felt like the closing of one chapter and the start of another. The warlord would still be out there, and there would be more dangers ahead. But for now, Ethan and Syrah walked side by side. No longer hunter and hunted, but partners in survival, and in the quiet between them, there was something unspoken, a promise neither would break.